That's CPD Show.
My name is Chris and I'll be your host for today. And today I'm joined on the island by Pastor Dave Wade. Dave has led Bridge Church in Lincoln since 2005 as the senior leader and is responsible for bringing vision and direction to the church. Dave currently provides oversight to another local AOG church as well, and is also an approved tutor at Missio Dei, which is AOG's Bible college. Dave's also served as the C23 Coach for the Ministers in Training Program with AOG. Dave is married to Sian, and they have 3 children, and he's also a registered foster carer as well. Dave, welcome to the pod. It's great to have you on board. Welcome.
It's great to be here, Chris.
Great, and I just wanted to pick up on the C23 Coach, because last time that I saw you interacting as a coach with the Ministers in Training, you were given some what I'm classing as preacher's sneakers.
Yeah.
You want to just tell us a little bit about your preacher's sneakers?
Oh, they're amazing. So I wasn't expecting that at all, but kind of at the end of my 3 years serving on that cohort, I was given a pair of Adidas trainers, some bright red ones because of my affiliation to the mighty Liverpool FC. And but it had my name kind of engraved on the side in gold as well. So yeah, lovely. And I'm not normally someone that would spend any amount of money really on trainers. So it's kind of, I spend my money on other things, but trainers I'll just go to, Matalan or somewhere like that. So to get this nice pair was amazing. And they are my special occasion trainers. So if I'm going somewhere nice or speaking on a Sunday, yeah, they are my preacher's sneakers.
Okay, so whoever runs the Preachers and Sneakers Instagram account, if they are listening to this, then we know where your trainers have come from. They were a gift. So yes, absolutely. No, fantastic. That's really, really good and lovely to hear about that. And also, the work that you've been doing with the C23 cohort. That's obviously really exciting. All of that work that's been over the last 3 years and how that's going. And so great. Brilliant. Well, we are here to talk about development today. That's the job of the day. But of course, this isn't, I say this every podcast, this isn't a desert island. This is a dessert island.
Nice.
And of course, that's a much better island in my opinion. So we're here to talk firstly about your favorite dessert. So what is your favorite dessert?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important for me to say, in general, I'm not really a massive dessert person. If I had a choice, I would rather have seconds of my main course. But there are some exceptions to that. And Sian does make a beautiful chocolate brownie, although I don't really eat that too much just because I know what goes in it and I want to live for another 30 years. It's delicious. But my favorite is her homemade bread and butter pudding. It is just exceptional, because you can get bread and butter pudding at a restaurant or something, and sometimes it's nice, sometimes it's not, but I don't know what it is she does with it, but it's just that mix of sweet and savory, and beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Well, before we started the podcast, I said to you that a bread and butter pudding was the first kind of dessert I remember as a kid that really, like, it kind of messes with your perception, because bread in a pudding often doesn't, it doesn't make sense. You think of bread as like a sandwich or something.
Exactly.
So is it because you're more of a kind of a savory person? Is it that sort of savory nature that
yeah, I mean, I've never really thought of it in that way, but I'm assuming that probably is what it is, because I do have a bit of a sweet tooth, but kind of just a mixture of that with the kind of the bread and the butter and the savory elements of it mixed together, it just that perfect I think that's probably why I like sweet and salty popcorn as well. It's just, oh my goodness, I could just it's like some people, like when they talk about Moorish food, they'll say like Pringles, once you pop you can't stop. With me it's salt and sweet popcorn. Once I open that bag, there's no going.
It's that kind of that fusion between the savory and the sweet, which is very good. So I like a dessert as well that tends to be slightly less on the sweet side. So things that sort of just pair it back, maybe something that's got a bit of sharpness to it, something like that. That's always pretty good. So no, I love that. And do you have the bread and butter pudding? I need to say bread and butter pudding. Bread and butter pudding. Do you say the bread and butter? Do you have the bread and butter pudding with? Is it ice cream? Do you have it with cream on its own?
I have it on its own. Yeah, I'm not really into ice cream or cream or sauces in general, really. So just just on its own, maybe a little bit of cream, but most of the time, just because it's quite gooey anyway,
Yes.
and it's just yeah, with the butter in it, gives it that kind of gooey feel to it. I don't think it needs anything added in, to be honest.
It's a great dessert, and I have heard some, people have tried to sort of do variants of it where they upgrade the bread to brioche. And
Yeah.
would you do anything like that, or is it sweet enough?
Just plain basic. I mean, I don't normally eat white bread. I'd normally have half and half, but or wholemeal. But with bread and butter pudding, definitely just plain bog standard white bread. Let the other ingredients do their job, I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, okay. Well, I think that's a great one, and really did take me back to my childhood of having
Right.
that at home. And so, yeah, I think that's a very welcome addition to the dessert island. Brilliant. Okay, well, we've talked about desserts. It's probably now time that we talk about development. So, do you want to introduce us to the first resource that you brought with you today?
Yeah. So for me, a book. I want to be careful because sometimes people say things like, this book has changed my life, and it's overblown statements. But I generally would have to say the book Emotionally Healthy Leader by Peter Scazzero has in many ways helped me on a path that has changed my life. I think, my reflections, I was thinking about this, preparing for this. I am a Christian church leader that's been part of a particular church tradition my whole life, Assemblies of God, Pentecostal, charismatic. And whilst I love being part of that environment and I wouldn't swap it for anything, I do think that every stream or every denomination potentially has blind spots to it as well, which is why the whole body of Christ, we need to learn off one another. And I would say my experiences growing up, we probably didn't really talk much about self-leadership or well-being as much as maybe other streams or denominations would do. And I don't think that's necessarily because we didn't believe in it, but I think the hallmarks of our movement are so focused on getting out there, getting the job done, breakthrough, all that kind of stuff, which is absolutely right. I think historically, maybe as leaders, we've got into that realm where we're just doing, and not necessarily thinking about some of the consequences of that. And even in the whole thing around the business of life, and often for us, rest will be reactive rather than proactive, all of those kind of things. And so in so many ways, the book, which really is, in many ways, it's a simple book around, looking after yourself, leading yourself, being well, mind, body, spirit, and soul, is the most important ministry you can ever undertake because you can't lead others if you can't lead yourself. And just some practical tips and kind of observations around how we as leaders can do that better. I would say my other observation around kind of our breed of church would be we're not great at what I would call rhythm or patterns because we are part of a breed of church that's very much into the spontaneity, the freedom of the spirit, all of those kind of things. I think often that can reflect in our own lives as well. And sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that anything that's routine or anything that's rhythmic to it or seasonal is, almost like stifling what God wants to do in and through our lives. And so this book really, in many ways, I don't believe that Peter Scazzero is from a charismatic background. I'm not completely sure what his background is, but it just talks more about having healthy rhythms and patterns in your life that are proactive rather than reactive, and focusing on the fact that your emotions and an understanding of your emotions really is a springboard to wellness, both in yourself and how you lead others. So a deeply, deeply challenging book. There's not many books that I've read over and over again. This is a book that I come back to on a regular basis just because it's not really a book about information. It's one of those ones where you read a chapter and you're like, okay, I'll need another 10 years to think through the implications of what's being said in this chapter. So I know, like we were talking off screen, that you've heard a lot of people talk about the book. It's one that I would highly, highly recommend to everybody because it just really gets you thinking. And I think the best books give you more questions and answers. And that's definitely what this book does, because I'm still out working things from it even now.
Yeah, I would love to hear what sort of questions that are being continually raised in you from this book. What questions has it made you think about?
I think the biggest one is around what does proactive rest and well-being look like? And I don't think that's just a challenge for Christian leaders. I think that's a challenge for anyone that's at the front line of anything. Often for us, concepts like rest, recreation, things like that, very often are reactive. And I think even when we think of kind of Christian tradition or in pastoral ministry, historically pastors have taken a Monday as their day off. And often historically the thought process is you've had a really busy weekend, so you need to stop on a Monday because you're tired. And it's just flipping the concept on its head of, if you're stopping because of a reaction to being overtired or overstressed or burnt out, you've probably gone too far over the line to begin with. Whereas kind of proactive rest in preparation. So for example, we won't have time to go into the implications of this, but as an organization, we have instituted what we call an organizational Sabbath. So on a Friday, the office is closed. Those that do work full time, Friday isn't their day off, but Friday is their Sabbath. Peter Scazzero, the best section of the book is the one where he talks about Sabbath and about the original principles of Sabbath and what that looks like in a Western context. Understanding that our life patterns mean that we can't necessarily copy exactly how the Jewish people did Sabbath, but what are the principles behind it? And so our staff that are full-time, their Friday is, we call it Sabbath, but another way of saying it's a personal development day. So Friday is your day off. You do whatever you like on that. Often it's family time, etc. But Friday, we're paying you to do what we would call a different type of work, which is working on yourself, which is as meaningful as serving other people. And I think that's a mindset shift, isn't it?
Yeah, what impact have you seen in your staff by implementing that Sabbath working day? Because I've never heard of that before, and I think it's really fascinating. I'd really like to dive into that and to see what's the fruit that you've seen from it.
Yeah, it's something that happens quite often in Scandinavia. In secular society, often a 4-day working week is part of that world. But for us, I wouldn't say we're 100% exactly where we want it to be, but I definitely think in terms of the well-being of our staff, we do some other stuff around well-being as well, but just the freshness of our staff, we've seen a massive impact on Sundays. So the whole thing of effectively you're finishing quote unquote work on a Thursday, going into then looking after yourself, building yourself up on a Friday, into a rest day, family time on a Saturday. What we've seen is coming in then on a Sunday, just a whole other level of freshness, enthusiasm, and the evidence of that will be in intangible things like how people are leading, how people are preaching. We've really, there's no coincidence that since that's been in place, we've seen a really sharp upturn on I know it's a clinical word, but our delivery on a Sunday is altogether in a different place. And I'm absolutely convinced that's down to some of the tweaks we've made structurally. And I think in terms of trying to just get people to understand the why behind what we're doing, it's really helping people to realize that working on yourself as a leader is work. And it's so counterintuitive because in our Western world, we just don't think that way. And particularly in Western Christianity, we don't think that way because it's all about sacrifice, serving others, more. I could talk a whole lot about this whole concept of more is better than less. Well, scripturally, it's not always better than less.
Mm,
Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But it's hardwired into our thinking that more is always better than less. And
yeah.
it's just not true. And you've got the whole thing of the guilt. So we did quite a lot of time speaking about it before we implemented it, trying to preempt some of the cultural challenges that we would face. So, don't be guilty that on a Friday you are doing some study or you're reading a book or you're like, that's work, because you are becoming a better person, therefore your leadership is going to be better. So we've had to spend quite a bit of time talking that through, and yeah, but it's made a huge difference.
No, I love that idea, and I think when you're speaking, I'm thinking about how much our Western Christianity has been influenced by the Industrial Revolution. We've kind of got this Industrial Revolution Christianity, the way it's about work and production and doing
Yeah,
and giving
yeah,
out and
yeah,
so much so that we don't spend time to think about actually the development of yourself is actually going to reap benefits for the
yeah,
other 4 days that you're at work.
yeah, yeah,
And so what happens if we took that time of investment to input into ourselves, and what difference that can make to us emotionally, and even in terms of our productivity as well. I think that there's something certainly very fascinating about that. Okay, well that's the Emotionally Healthy Leader by Pete Scarsero. I think that's a really fascinating idea and concept. I really enjoyed talking about that. Should we move on to your second resource? What's the second
yeah.
one that
So
you
this
thought
is
we'd give?
by a American pastor who leads a church called Summit Church, in North Carolina, and it's called Gaining by Losing. And one of the things I wanted to do in my in my development of myself is just stretch myself by reading or listening to people who, again, are from maybe slightly different traditions, and just view things slightly differently. And so he leads a church that's very kind of outward thinking, missional, but it wouldn't necessarily call themselves charismatic. Um, but one of the things that he's really big on is the whole challenge of getting the balance between gathering people for events and truly discipling people, to be missional. And again, I guess this is some of our Western perceptions of how we view success in church. And he does have a large church, by the way. It's 12,000 people, but he's absolutely passionate about, you know the circle of Matthew 28 is a disciple ultimately can't be called a disciple fully if they're not engaging other disciples. The circle's not complete so when Jesus says, and teaching others to obey everything I've commanded you, that part of that verse in Matthew 28 is you do what I'm now doing to you. You replicate my discipleship of you in your discipleship of others. And again, I know this might be generalizing, but perhaps one of the challenges in the Western world is that we have a lot of followers and we have a lot of attenders of church, but how many of those are what I would call full circle disciples? How many layers down the pyramid, if you want to use that phrase, is development happening in our church? Because development's not just about leaders. Everybody's called to develop other people, because that's just discipleship. And so he talks about just some principles, which links into another book that I would recommend. It's not on my three, but you've probably read it. Simple Church. It's very similar to some of the principles around there in terms of the application, which comes back to what we said before about sometimes doing less things is more productive than doing more things. And just basic principles around, if you could do three things at a 9 out of 10, let's say, surely that's better than doing 15 things that are all 4 out of 10. And it's just that simple principle of you gain a kingdom principle. So the title comes from gain, or gain could be another word for success. Success is not seen in ultimately how many you gather, but success is seen ultimately in how many you release.
No, I think that's really fascinating. I've read Simple Church. It's one of my favorite books. Talk to me about how that's worked out practically for you. Have you had to go through a process of looking at simplifying what you've done? How has that worked out for you practically
Yeah,
in the
I
church
think there's
context?
been two things really for us. One would be kind of in a general sense in our church structures, we're continually looking to simplify that and to simplify our processes. But the other aspect of that is the sense of how much. So ultimately, as a leadership team, we understand that everything ultimately rests on your shoulders. We get that you're responsible for everything, but that doesn't mean you do everything. And I think sometimes what happens is we mistake responsibility for carrying the can for everything. And the principle of this book is there's a great section in it where he talks about there are I think there's 3 layers of ministry in a church. He says that the first layer of ministry is like ministries or projects or events that you as a leadership team you own those things. In other words, you are hands-on, you are responsible, you dare not drop the ball with those things. But he says those things actually should be quite a small, confined number of things, basically eldership responsibility level stuff. But then he says churches that really think this way really think more about the second level of ministries, which is what he calls ministries that you catalyze as a leadership team, which is then when he talks into principles around the difference between delegation and empowerment. So delegation being just, well, this is still my thing, I'm just asking you to do it on my behalf, whereas empowerment is, this is our thing, but you're running with it, but you are accountable to us, and just principles around that. So the more things in the life of the church where others are taking real responsibility for and are as passionate about it as you are as a leader, that's where you really start to see multiplication growth in your church. Because I think, it's really caused me to think a little bit around just even things around casting vision. I was talking to someone the other day about this, and I was reflecting on our movement, Assemblies of God, and Glyn's leadership. And I was saying, the reason that Glyn is such an exceptional leader is because I don't see myself as serving his vision for AOG. I see it as, this is my vision for AOG just as much as his, because what he's done, and it would be really interesting to hear, I'm sure this is deliberate, but what are the principles in how he's done this? He's able to release vision to people in such a way that they grasp it and embrace it as their own, while still recognizing his authority and leadership. So it's not like, oh, he's not the national leader. No, I respect his position and his leadership, but I don't see it as merely, what can I do to serve you, Glyn? It's actually that this is now my thing as much as yours, and so I'm as responsible for it. I must play my part. And so it's that thing of leadership, leading in a way that really raises people up to take that sense of ownership of something. And so, because if you don't own something, you're not going to be passionate about it. And that's the dilemma between, what is the role of leadership? Ultimately, it's not to control everything, but it is to create an atmosphere where everyone steps up and goes, hey, we're all in this. And you see healthy cultures where we language is much more than me language or I language. That's indicative of a really healthy leadership culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the role of leadership is giving leadership away, giving authority away to
Absolutely.
raise other people up, isn't it? And
Yeah.
and it seems like this book certainly does that job of being able to help think about how do you not just delegate, but go that next further, empower leaders, because it's only when we get to that point where we think, actually, no, this is not just about me and my thing. This is about how do we as a congregation say, how do we have a shared vision where we all feel like we've got a sense of ownership and working together towards that. So that sounds really fascinating. So that's Gaining by Losing by JD Greer. Should we move on to your final resource? Yeah, let's move on to your last one.
Yeah, so I think you've had this on your podcast before, but But one of my favorite books is Communicating for Change by Andy Stanley. And that has really, in terms of kind of practical outworking of our values, that has really, really helped us to shape how we lead people from the platform. So, you know, we are of the belief, like I guess most of our churches are, that discipleship takes place off the platform as well as on the platform. But recognizing that on a Sunday or when you gather and you have that microphone, you're not just there to tickle people's ears, but you're there to you lead them through what you're communicating. So, you know, the principle of communicating for change is simply that communicating in a way that doesn't just inspire people, but inspires people to action and inspires people to change. If it's just a, well, that was a nice message, that's not necessarily a sign that it's a good message. And so I was thinking about this the other day, you know, what is the sign that you've preached well? Well, loads of people coming up to you at the end of the service saying that was a great message isn't necessarily an indication that it was a great message. Because I know that there's times when I've been in environments where God has spoken powerfully through someone and it's cut me to my core, you know, and I know it's a great message, but I wouldn't go up to the preacher and go, well, that was a good message in the sense of it was nice. Because actually sometimes great messages aren't nice. Sometimes great messages, they challenge you in such a way where you don't actually like what's being said, but you know it's true. You know, that sense of, I don't like what you're telling me now, God, but I appreciate that you are telling me because I know it's for my good. So yeah, the principle of it's trying to journey people in the way that you speak, in the way that you communicate. And you may well have heard of the 5 principles that he talks about, you know, in the journey of the me, we, God, you, we. And you know, he talks quite a lot about the principle of that journey is, you know, the me, you start off with by, you know, preaching should always be personal because, you know, you can't separate you as a person with the message you're delivering. So you are starting by drawing people into your world, but then you're immediately bringing them into that, and now we're part of that world. And then God, you know, what does God have to say? Because God is the ultimate authority on what we're saying here. But then ultimately, I love the last parts. You know, there is a personal application, but then there's a collective application. And I love that. And again, when we've been reflecting on Western Christianity, one of my observations is we live in a very individualistic culture, and that often is rampant in the church. You know, what did God say to me today? Or I didn't get much out of the meeting, or all that kind of language. And the whole premise of this book is that ultimately, whatever you are communicating, if you're preaching culture, if you're preaching values, if you're preaching, you know, all of that kind of stuff, vision, ultimately you're preaching to a group of people, not just an individual in that. And so that's really helped shape our preaching in terms of preaching with clarity, but also the sense of what is it that we are sharing with people. We're not preaching first and foremost vision, I believe. I think first and foremost we're preaching values, but the application of it is always vision. And I think sometimes in our messages, if we just go straight to vision, we're effectively teaching people what rather than telling them why. Whereas if your message really is about a value or a cultural element, yes, the application of that is now what are we going to do about that? It's a bit like, have you read any of the stuff on Bill Hybels on leading from here to there?
I haven't. No, I've read a little bit of
Yeah,
Hybels,
it's a very
old stuff,
similar
but
principle of, you know, he talks about when you're casting vision or you've got a big announcement to make, or you're bringing change to the church. What he says is that you almost need to disrupt people's present before you sell them a future. Because if you just say to someone, we're doing this, the immediate human nature response is, well, why? But if you talk into the, you know, why we can't stay here, figuratively speaking, and people get, oh yeah, okay, well, we can't stay here. And then the application is, this is why we're doing this. It's a similar principle. You know, our communication is about values. This is who we are. This is what we believe. This is why we believe it. So therefore, let's do it. A simple example of that would be, you know, serving our community. You know, you wouldn't necessarily talk first and foremost about let's get out there and do loads of stuff. Really, you'd want to paint the picture of God's heart for communities, you know, his love, his passion for people who don't yet know Jesus. So the application is, well, surely we must go and do this then, that type of thing. And so that book's been really helpful in helping us provide a frame. We don't rigidly say to people, you've got to go through those 5 points, but they've, you know, people understand, okay, the end of the day, we are communicating to a group of people. So let's not make this message too individualistic. And at the end of the day, our application must always be collective. What are we as Bridge Church going to do with what's been shared this morning? And that's been really powerful for us.
Yeah. So for you, is it used as a sort of a preach outline, or do you use it more for kind of like vision talks, or is it for both? Is it a both and sort of situation?
Yeah. So I think we started off using that model, particularly with some of our newer preachers. Actually, you know, we want you to really think about those 5 elements as almost like a guide. We don't really do that now because I think it's the values behind what he shares are embedded into our communicators. So no one sitting down now would go, okay, where are my 5 sections? No one would prepare it like that anymore because it's in us now. But the principles behind it is, you know, for me, the biggest principle is the bit at the end around the application must always be visionary, and the application ultimately should always be collective, because we are the body of Christ, not just an individual in the room. And so our messages always end with a visionary application, whatever the message, and it always ends with a collective application. That doesn't mean that we don't speak into individual situations or give people opportunity to receive prayer, etc. But we want the last words ringing in people's ears as they go out of church being, I am a part of something bigger than just myself.
Yeah, I love that actually, and that's something that I've not thought about with. I mean, I've read this book before, and I'm always thought of it as more of a kind of a preaching tool, which obviously it is. But I think what I love about what you said there is that thinking about how does every message link to vision, that it's not just the individual. And obviously we kind of live in this sort of rampant individualistic society, and so we're always having to find ways that we can break out of that individualism. And I think so often, you know, modern Christianity has played into that a little bit, which I think is a bit which I don't think is the most helpful for building disciples, because I think growing disciples, you need to break out of it's about me, and it needs to be a life surrendered. So you have to get into the we very quickly, and so going into that collective, I think, is really helpful. So I think that's a great point. I think for any minister listening to this, think about at the end of your preach, you know, maybe whatever style that you choose, but how does that message link into the collective vision, and how into the we. And I love that thought, because, you know, you could be, you know, there's lots of different styles of preaching, but I think they could all end with that application that links to the to visionary element. So I think that's fascinating, really, really interesting, and really a really good thing for any minister to think through when they're preaching.
And I think as a last just simple comment on that, and I don't particularly have an answer to this, but I'm certainly not one of those people that is small church is better than big church. I'm not of that school of thought at all. But having said that, I do wonder whether really large crowds of people can potentially have almost a reverse effect of what we're trying to achieve with that, in that, does there come a point where if someone's just part of a mass of people, does that become a hindrance to them taking real ownership of that context? And again, I don't really have an answer to that. And I'm certainly not, you know, we shouldn't have big churches or any of that, but it's just a thought, you know, what environments really aid a sense of ownership of the thing that you are part of. And I know that you can have big and small together, and that's probably part of the answer, that, you know, your Sunday gathering or whatever you call it is only part of what it means to be the church. So therefore you have to be really, really strong at making other mechanisms where it is smaller so that people feel more engaged. That's probably half of the answer. But again, it's just stuff that gets me thinking, okay, so in a true disciple making culture, true discipleship doesn't take place in a big group. It takes place in smaller groups. So it's really thinking through how do we do those things effectively, particularly in a Western context that doesn't particularly engage in smaller stuff in the way that perhaps they do in South America or in Africa. That's much more, the roots of those societies are much more around community and family. So it's much easier to do those things. It seems in the West we're constantly fighting against, even when you look at the statistics around connect group engagement in most churches compared to other continents, you know, it's indicative, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking through how that can be lived out, how a message can be lived out within a smaller group, I think, and especially for churches that are large. But I think as soon as you hit over a certain size, you know, you're coming up against those issues about how do you embed something where people are now living this out. And I think that's, you know, this probably links into, you know, a bit of gaining by losing, maybe simple church, you know, where you're thinking about what are the things that we're actually doing and making sure that we're not just building crowds, but really that we're building disciples by doing what we're doing. So in one sense, that these books all kind of they all link together and they speak to one another in what they're doing. And I think there's some really interesting thoughts. It'd be great actually to unpack that at another point. I think just to think through how do we really think through discipleship to ingrain something from a large context into a small context. I think is really interesting. I think there's some work that probably the church at large need to probably think through on that. So no, great. Well, that's Communicating for a Change by Andy Stanley, and three great options there, three books. We've got The Emotionally Healthy Leader by Pete Scazzaro, Gaining by Losing by J.D. Greer, and Communicating for a Change by Andy Stanley. Three excellent books there, and certainly all very much recommended. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Really enjoyed that, and loved hearing about your bread and butter pudding as well. And so I have to make sure I make it to the Wade household and come around with some bread and butter pudding. That sounds great to me. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll speak to you soon.
Cheers.